Thanks, Ryan. So when Roger asked me to do the lead-off on this, he really kind of wanted me to introduce the ideas of EBIPM and talk about what it is, and basically provide some, not specific examples, but maybe sort of a general discussion of why we think this approach is valuable and how people can use it. And so I'm going to go ahead and try and do some of that and talk about our area-wide project, which is a lot of the posters you'll see in the back are associated with our area-wide project. So I'll tell you what that is. And EBIPM, of course, is ecologically-based invasive plant management. And there's a model I'll go through very quickly, and the subsequent speakers will spend time developing individual parts of that model. And so hopefully, and I'll repeat this, it's not senility sitting in, I'm repeating it because I will intend to repeat it, that this is really the goal of the symposium, is to basically take you through that model, all the participants, and hopefully make everybody more comfortable with how they might use this approach. So for my presentation, I'm going to talk about this, what we call the area-wide, which is a broad-scale research and management effort. In this case, 5 states are involved. I'll talk a little bit about that EBIPM model and just sort of introduce the concept and talk a little bit about the pieces. And as I say, subsequent speakers will expand on those individual pieces and show you how to use those. And then I thought sometimes it's kind of valuable when it's hard to grasp the concept to tie it to something we know more about. And so I'm going to use an analogy from auto mechanics, which something at least I can relate to. I hope a few others can. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about the advantages of using this kind of just a conceptual approach, just sort of generally speaking, not going into specifics, but as a general rule, having this kind of a model to work from. What are the advantages that we have as a profession when we adopt a model of this sort? Is the volume okay for everybody? Do I need to get closer to the speaker? Or? No? Okay, so what is an area-wide project? Because this is something, most of us that participate in this are from the Agricultural Research Service. For those of you not familiar with ARS, it's the primary research agency within USDA. And so the Research Center in Burns, we're a cooperative research center between Oregon State University and ARS, but the bulk of the folks doing this kind of work are ARS. So really what these projects are meant to do is take integrated pest management and apply it over large areas. And it generally has to be a pest that's of pretty significant interest. And the way it's been structured in the past is the idea we apply for these competitively within ARS. And the idea is that if ARS scientists have worked out a control measure for a particular pest, then this is a way to get it applied. So let's say that a control measure, like there was an area-wide for, I don't remember what insect it was, but some pest of apples in eastern Washington. And they had the control measures pretty well worked out, but they weren't being applied. And so they developed a broad-scale project to try and get that out into the world and get people to use it. Well, the problem is we deal with annual grasses. And we don't have a real good single solution for annual grasses. It's generally an overall management approach that includes multiple tools and often takes a fairly long time period. There isn't that silver bullet. And so this was a very different situation than what we're used to, but when Roger put this proposal together, he basically did it as a very integrated project that would take a lot of tools, would test sort of general approaches, and the basis for all of this was the EBIPM model. It was basically trying that at different places around the Great Basin. And so this has been a 5-year project, and we're getting towards the end of the 5 years. So every project like this has to have a logo. We have ours. You see the publications and so forth that use this logo. It's associated with area-wide. It even says it up there, although, again, a lot of people don't know what area-wide is. So, and here's the general area that of the area-wide, if you will. It's these 5 states. And watersheds were selected within each state, and then there was an economic analysis that was done initially. Treatments were applied, and there'll be an assessment of how effective those treatments were and what the benefits of the treatments were. So a lot of cooperators, just to identify. I always worry about doing a slide like this on this broader project because you're afraid you'll leave somebody out. But as you can see, there are 5 ARS locations involved. We have Oregon State, UC Davis, University of Nevada, Reno, Utah State's participating. Some BLM has been active in this. We have some state agencies, private landowners, so a very broad group. In fact, some private landowners have been very involved. The reception last night was sponsored by the Circle Bar Ranch. And it's been a very successful project, and I wanted to show this quote. This is an email I received probably a week and a half or 2 weeks ago. This project, this area-wide project, was given the award for excellence in technology transfer from something called the Federal Laboratory Consortium for Technology Transfer. And this is a group that's very heavily dominated by Defense, Department of Defense, and Department of Energy. So they get most of the awards because they put the most money into this effort. And so it's, you know, things associated with energy independence and blowing people up. And so we're a little different than that, and it's very unusual for an ag effort of this sort to get recognized. So I just wanted to mention that this has been a very successful project, and the people that participated in this award were Roger, who's sort of the overall manager who put this together, brought the money to this area, Brenda and Ryan Steineckert, who of course have done a lot of these products that we have that really are very positive from an outreach standpoint, and Tom Monaco, who's made major contributions, and Stuart Hardigree from Boise. So anyway, I just wanted to mention this effort has been recognized at the national level. And this is the overall model, which you'll see time and time again. And I know what happens when I put up something like this. You know, you start to glaze over, your mind starts going elsewhere. And what we found in our efforts is that, you know, this is a little overwhelming, and so it's much easier to break it down into pieces. And when you do it step by step, when you take a fairly comprehensive model, that when you first look at it, it's very hard for your mind to absorb it all. If we break it down step by step, it becomes much easier for people to grasp and to use. And so I'll try and do that. And I'm going to go into these in more detail, but what we basically do is we go through this series of steps, and you only have to deal with one thing at a time, which conceptually makes it much easier. And basically at the end, put together a plan and assessment strategy so that, you know, you can see if your plan is working. And one of the problems that we've seen a lot is that you can put $200 an acre into restoring an area, but if you don't manage it correctly afterwards, 5 years, 10 years down the road, you end up where you started. And so having an overall plan to basically not just restore a piece of ground, but keep it in the desirable state is really important. And we think it's kind of important to do some assessments as well. And that's kind of a limitation we have in natural resource management, but I believe it's kind of an important step. So just to go through these in some detail, you of course have to decide where you are, what the current situation is. And I think Roger will talk later about using the sort of the range health assessment to do that. I mean, that's one tool. There are multiple tools for figuring out what the current situation is, but that's an important starting point, of course. The second is to figure out if you do have invaded ground, why has it been invaded? You know, what are the causes of the invasion of whatever the species is that you're having problems with? So we think identifying potential causes, and it's not always like you can point to a specific thing, but at least it's worth giving some thought to why you have the situation you have, if there's been an invasion. So we think there are some principles, and these are largely principles associated with plant succession, that you can apply to your decision making. And so basically you have to know, do you have desirable, if you have an invasion going on, or you have species you don't want, do you have desirable species on the site? Or do you have to add them to the site? Do you have sites where they get, you know, microsites where those plants can establish, or do you have to provide some disturbance, some way to get them to establish or expand? And what is it going to take to make sure they're able to compete with that background population of weeds that you have? So those are kind of the three basic mechanisms. So once you've kind of figured out what's going on with that, and again, I'm just going over this very briefly. Other speakers will cover these concepts in much greater detail. So then you would choose the appropriate strategies based on those principles of plant succession. So that's basically a lot of the idea behind this overall effort. And again, I'm doing this rather quickly. You'll get a lot more detail in subsequent talks. So then, as I mentioned, we have to set up a plan to make sure that if we go through the steps of restoring a site, that we maintain that site over time and keep it in a desirable condition. And probably we better have some way of assessing whether we're doing that or not, whether our management is successful. So what's the point of this model? It's really a thought process. You know, this isn't quantum physics. We're really talking about going through a step-by-step guide. And one of the advantages to that is that we can all approach a problem in a rather similar manner. So if we have invasive species, this model would allow us to, I'll mention this several times, allow us to communicate on how we approach a weed problem. So experienced managers, I think, do a lot of these steps already. It's really not that unusual that somebody would go out and go through the steps I mentioned mentally, whether they actually have a model in their hand or not. So this is probably just formalizing what a lot of people already do. And as I mentioned, I think the model is pretty effective communication tool, because if we have researchers approaching a weed problem and we have managers approaching a weed problem, we have different sites, different years, different people doing different things. This is what we found with the area-wide, is when we had a consistent model we were all using, we could talk about why we decided we had to do seeding, why we selected a particular control measure. You know, we had a kind of a basis for making decisions, as opposed to just doing the see weed, kill weed thing, you know, which is what we've done a lot of. We see a weed on the ground, we kill it, we're happy. 5 years later, that weed may be denser than it was when you first killed it, but at the time we're happy. And this is more of a long-term thought process. So I thought I'd do the auto mechanic analogy. I've known a lot of people, and my dad was a mechanic, and so he trained me in auto mechanics. And I've seen a lot of people that do this shade tree thing, where, you know, the vehicle isn't running right, you just start replacing stuff. And that gets kind of expensive, and it may or may not solve the problem. But we do the same sort of thing. And, you know, my point is, in weed management, we do some of those same sorts of things. We see weeds, we're going to kill the weed. We're not going to put necessarily as much thought as we probably need to into what got us to that point and what are the multiple steps that it's going to take to get us out. The easy stuff we've taken care of. You know, if it's a one-time treatment, it's relatively simple and cheap, we've probably already done it, and we're probably not worried about that weed if we have that easiest solution. And so you're all here, I assume, because you're dealing with more complicated solutions that, you know, haven't been resolved that easily. So the shade tree mechanics, they tend to just start replacing stuff. Don't diagnose the problem. I see a lot of that sort of thing going on. A professional mechanic, assuming they know what they're doing, will actually diagnose the problem and decide where to put their efforts, right? And hopefully, I mean, that's why you take a car to a mechanic. So let's say the car won't start. So there's generally these two things you want to check. Is there a fire? So you'll check out whether you pull your plug and crank the engine to see if you got spark, right? And if you have spark, then you don't run out and replace your coil. You don't worry about you know, there's things you just don't have to mess with if you have spark. And, you know, is there fuel? That's the second question. You know, in the old days, before fuel injection, you just took a flashlight and went down the carburetor, hit the throttle, and yeah, I've got gas, so I don't worry about the fuel pump and the filter, that sort of thing. So, you know, there's these simple things you can diagnose that push you in the right direction when you start solving the problem. And a manual is helpful in some cases. If anybody's ever owned one of these things, they needed a manual to keep it running, because it's not a very dependable car. So manuals are important, and that's what we try to provide, is some manuals. And you've got to get under there, poke around, kind of really look at the piece of ground you're going to manage. Or in this case, you know, sometimes more hands is better, and sometimes not. I'm guessing in this case, with 4 or 5 kids trying to deal with this engine, probably not, but they're pretty enthusiastic anyway. And, you know, occasionally you end up on the side of the road, broke down, you didn't have a manual. This guy clearly didn't have a manual. He's not very happy. You know, occasionally you can call for help and ask somebody who has experience with the problem how to solve the problem. And then occasionally you end up like this, where you just pretty much torch the whole thing. And we've seen examples of that in weed management and natural resources, where people went to extreme measures and really didn't, because they didn't think the problem through. So back to weeds. The model we're talking about is really not that different than going through the steps you would in auto mechanics and trying to diagnose the problems and figure out what the best solutions are and basically target target your efforts where they'll do the most good. So the idea is to really come up with a focus, identify what the problem is, and then select the appropriate tools. And get away from going to the tools first, because there's this tendency that I think we all have to go to the tool before we think through what the problem is. It's a natural tendency, I think, because I believe we all do it. So to give an example, and you'll see many more examples through the course of this symposium, but this is a situation where we have lots of medusa head, a very minimal background of native species, desirable species. You can see like a rabbit rush or two, but not much else out there. So the way we would approach this situation, we go out and do a diagnosis, is much different than the way we might approach this situation, which is we have a background of native species. In this case, the bunch grasses are still there, which is, of course, what we feel is most effective in competing with these annual grasses. So we have a background matrix of perennial bunch grasses in place, but we have medusa head in the interspaces. That's an entirely, you know, if you go through and diagnose the problem, that's an entirely different situation than this situation here, where there's no doubt that you will have to provide a seed source here. You can't simply control the medusa head. If your choice is just controlling the medusa head, as soon as that, whatever the control measure is done, you'll be right back at medusa head because you didn't have a seed source to occupy the site. In this case, different situation. So anyway, doing those initial diagnostics are really important. So just to give some general comments on what the value of having a system might be, I think that it does make us go through the steps. And even if it's something that we normally would do, I think one of the problems we have as we get experience, we tend to draw on our past experiences and we'll jump to conclusions in many cases. And I mean, that's sometimes a problem, you know, like the captain on the Titanic. He was too experienced, he knew how things were going to go, and they didn't go exactly as he expected. I think we have to be careful about making assumptions early based on our past experiences. This model makes us go through the steps, no matter how much experience we have. And I try to come up with sort of a science example. A lot of us look at data sets in research, and often we'll look at the data sets initially and we'll draw, you know, we have this nice story we're coming up with for our data and before we analyze it. And usually what happens, but we have to go through the statistics to basically make sure that we're just not seeing things that are not real differences. And often the statistics often screws up the good story that we had in our minds before we did that. But we have to go through that step so that we're required to in science. And I think that in many cases we jump to conclusions as scientists, and I think we see the same thing out in management, that we jump ahead without doing in this case, we're forced to do the appropriate analysis. So I do think it's a communication tool as people begin using it more effectively. I think we found out within the network of locations participating, we can begin to communicate about why we made particular decisions. If we all go through the same thought process, we have some consistency in how we deal with the problem. And that helps a little bit. Because I think, you know, in the past, people have just said, well, I have a, you know, fill-in-the-blank weed problem. How do I control it? That's typically the kind of discussion you hear. I get these kinds of calls all the time. How do you control X species? You know, this species, that species, the other species. Not what's the best approach to getting out of this invasion. You know, how do I recover a piece of ground? That's kind of, and so this helps us, I think, once we start using this, communicate a little bit better about what we're doing at different places, what we're doing, you know, across states and so forth. If people begin to adopt a model like this, I think it will effectively increase communication. And we can begin to, if we approach things similarly, we can see if we get consistent responses. And if we don't get consistent responses, then we can begin to talk about why we saw differences. Was it a particular kind of a year? You know, was the site different? But if we approach things similarly, we can communicate those differences. So again, this analogy, you know, we talk about whether we check spark and gas, I should say, there, versus just replacing stuff. So did we go through that process and say, well, we didn't have fire, therefore we replaced the coil? And this is a real problem, this business that we have a lot of management experience and we have some research that we can draw on. And frankly, there's always going to be a problem that we have a lot more experience out there in the field doing lots of different sites, and we'll do research on fairly limited areas because it's intensive work, it's expensive, there aren't that many of us. So combining those experiences is going to be important, and I think having a conceptual model helps with that, much the way the state transition models have functioned in general rangeland management. That was a way where if we didn't know about a transition from one plant community to another, we could use management knowledge to draw in what that transition would be. We'll never be able to test all possible treatments and combinations with research. We just won't. This is something we see a lot in Oregon, is that on public lands in particular, any decision is challenged, pretty much. Man, it's not 100% of the time, but okay, only 90% of the time. But there are a lot of challenges, particularly a lot of weed management efforts. And I believe that if people making the decisions can say, we went through this thought process, and this is why we chose the management options we did, I think it's a little bit more powerful than just simply saying, we had yellow star thistle, so we applied this chemical. That's why we made the decision. I just think that this sells a little bit better if you can go say we used this process, we went through these steps, we determined whether we had native species, or a bunch of perennial species on the site. It just makes for, I think, better communications. The approach is fairly adaptable, and I think you'll see as we go through the presentations here, there are lots of different situations where it was applied, so I think it is adaptable to different settings. And I think this is really important that experience can be captured and passed along. And I think that's facilitated by having a decent model. So as I mentioned earlier, I believe in weed management on rangelands. If there were simple problems, we wouldn't be here talking about them. They'd be taken care of and it'd be done. So a lot of what we're talking about here is putting different treatments together and taking a long-term view on management. And I think there'll be some examples here that'll present that. Particularly that's sort of the experience at the Circle Bar Ranch. That you can't, the one-time treatments, that going in and dealing with the problem and walking away are not going to get you where you want to be in terms of restoration. It's going to be a continual commitment, maybe multiple treatments, and it may be multiple years. So I think if we approach things in as systematic as possible, that we'll be more efficient than if we just kind of hit things the way we have in the past. So consistent way to evaluate, capture knowledge, and I think the talks in this symposium that follow hopefully will give you some comfort level on how you would use this model in your own situation. I think that will be repeated. So that model I showed up front, different parts of that will be taken and expanded upon in the symposium.